All right, do you want to start and people can join in?
Sure. Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm Tracy Walker from Journey Found. Meetings of the ARPA Transformational Advisory Committee are public meetings as defined by the Connecticut Freedom of Information Act and should follow those guidelines. As this public meeting is held virtually, it will be recorded and made available to view on the DDS website. Committee members must make a good faith effort to state their name and title each time they speak during the meeting. If a committee member would like to speak, please raise your hand and one of the co-chairs will acknowledge you. There is no public comment portion to this meeting. Members of the public are able to join, watch, and listen only. And with that, everyone has received the minutes from the November 1st meeting. Do we have any additions or revisions to the minutes? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. So given that, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as submitted?
So moved.
So I saw Win as first. Barry, can I make you the second?
Sure.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. And with that, I will jump to Peter Mason.
Okay. So I'm going to jump around on the agenda and just go right to our initiative update. So one of the things that I wanted to bring forward after hearing from the providers and consultating with our leadership. So a major change is that we will not be requiring a transition plan for all congregate settings. We're going to move toward strongly encouraging providers, but we are taking the mandatory piece out of this so that, it will be for agencies that we hope will do this and work with us. But we're not going to require that. The other thing that we're looking at doing is we're looking at, as we work through the first phase, since it's no longer the whole voluntary and mandatory piece now becomes a little confusing. So we're going to start looking at the first phase more as a pilot as we start to see how this works and be able to work with those agencies in the beginning and then make changes as we go into the second phase of this. So we'll be working through that a little bit more as we go forward. The other thing we're doing is we're trying to look at our resources for the regions. So we're going to try to move towards like a submission period. So from this time period to this time period, anybody who submits a plan within that will then be able to then have the regions review that and get back to providers by a specific date. So it just kind of be able to excuse me, move this a little bit better with the regions and they'll be able to plan a little bit more. We've been working through the transition document. We've taken everybody's comments and suggestions. We have a couple more edits to go. We've done the same thing with our transition plan template. We've been able to work through that as well, so that we're looking at that this hopefully will be going out. We're looking at that to go out on December 1st. Greg, when he makes his update on the individual engagement about the letter they're working on with McDowell Communications to get out to the families and stuff. And I think that's it for our ARPA initiative. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. The other thing I wanted just to go through is
Joe Carvalho, DDS. Peter, I see Win Efforts has raised his hand.
oh, go ahead, Win.
Sorry about that, Peter. I just want to a question for you in terms of the first and the second stages. The first one you said is going to be dealt with more as a pilot. Will there be adequate capacity in this? How's this going to affect capacity in both of the stages?
Capacity in terms of what?
Well, having money for incentives, basically.
At this point, I don't think it's going to affect that. I mean, I think there's plenty of money. So as we've been saying, in terms of the ARPA dollars, that, it's going to be first come, first serve. But what we've also been working with the department is that providers that are putting in a transition plan that is approved, that at this point there will be, if they need to use just state funds only, they're going to do that as well. So
Okay.
they're working
Okay.
forward, that's the goal and the mission, unless we hit into a depression and all the money's gone, but that is the commitment that department's making at this point.
Okay. Thanks for answering it that way. That was a better way than I asked the question.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions on that? All right. So for McDowell, we have engaged with them. They're at this point, they're in the research phase as well. They've been going through all the minutes of the various committees. We've had a number of contacts with them. They're looking at coming to the different groups, the different committees. One of the things that they're working on is a survey for individuals as to their knowledge and interest in the new in the alternative residential supports. And one of the things that we've set up in the scope of service is an outcome piece to this. So that survey will be done to determine people's knowledge and interest. And then we're going to look at it 20 months from now, do the survey again and see if that interest and the interest and knowledge of what we're trying to do is it has increased. So we want to make sure that, what we have done, did it actually work, and are people more informed as to where we're going? So that's what they're looking at. And so they wanted to try to get more in more of that survey done so that they can come to the various committees and ask for their input. So it looks like they'll be coming to the various committees maybe the middle of December, but it's probably going to be more like the first of the year that they'll come in and be able to present more specifics on terms of this, in terms of the survey and stuff. They'll also have come up with a communication plan at that point, and how to develop the message, which we feel is very important. We're trying to do it in such a way that it's short, concise, and at the learning modalities of the various people, so that we can make sure that we're hitting the whole spectrum. That, of course, that also includes the various languages as well. They'll be looking at what's the best way to deploy the message. Because we don't have a good way of having people's email addresses and maintaining those email addresses, I think a lot of this stuff is going to be done by snail mail. We just don't feel confident that we have a database of all the emails that would be really applicable. So We have a feeling that's where we're going to do a lot of that. And there'll be press releases and all that kind of stuff as well. So some of the things that their outcomes for them is to develop a project communications plan and communications calendar, which they should have done by the beginning of the year. Successfully develop and deploy messaging on the transformation initiative that communicates to people with different learning modalities. And what we have is that 90% of the DDS stakeholders survey will acknowledge they have some understanding of the initiative. We feel that's a high mark, but that's really what our goal is, to make sure people know it. So that, when providers come up with the plan, they don't hit parents and who are saying, I don't even know what this means. So we'll get to that 90%. And then a communication strategy to increase stakeholders' interest in the alternative community-based settings. And that's what I said, is we'll do those surveys. And we're hoping that at the end of it, 65% of all stakeholders will have an improved opinion of alternative residential and day community settings. So we're trying to make this outcome-based, and McDowell seems to be really involved and well on their way. So we're pretty excited to have them. And
This is Tracy Walker again. It looks like Barry, you have your hand up.
Yep, thank you. So Barry Simon Oak Hill. So Peter, if they're sending out a survey about alternative residential and day programming services, does that mean that we're going to have definitions as to what those services are, and as a provider, what the rates would be for those services in order to decide whether we can provide them?
so my understanding, this is the first one that's going to go out, is going to be what we have today. My understanding is that the rates should be adjusted for the minimum wage as of the beginning of the year. I think what I've heard is January 1st. So everybody should know what those rates are as of January 1st. That's my understanding. And this will then go out and find out what the interest is from individuals as to whether they know what those services are. And obviously we'll have to have some definitions within the survey, and whether they would be interested in now. And then we will see what happens come next year.
This is Tracy Walker again. Michael, you have your hand up.
Michael Beloff, parent and agency director. I think, Peter, if in phase one, we're going to just be educating families as to what current options are available for day and residential, I don't know that we want to call them alternatives. We want to say in the phase one, this is what you can choose as to what we have now. And then I'm hoping that the goal of this process will be to offer alternatives, as Barry said, at different rate scales. And we should indicate in phase one that these are what's now. We hope that in X period of time, we're going to have other alternatives to this, which will be communicated with you in phase two. And I think that's important in the communication.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
This is Tracy Walker again. I don't see any other hand. Oh, Barry, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, so so playing off of Michael's comment, like I would suggest we refer to services as existing services, or new and alternative services, as you're like continuing to play with and or differentiate when you make that transition.
I get that, and I guess this is Peter Mason. I think when we were referring to alternative, it was alternative to the congregate setting. So I think how we word that, so to make sure that that's what people understand.
Okay.
So I think that's that distinction and stuff.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, this is Tracy Walker again. I do not see any other hands up, Peter.
Okay. What's next on the agenda? Let me see.
So, Day.
Yeah, all right. Keith, as I said, isn't here. And I know they met last time. And once again, I think they went over was regarding the outcomes. And so we'll be sharing that later in the meeting.
Okay. DDS engagement, is that you, Joe?
Hi, thank you, Tracy. Joe
I'm just
Carvalho,
gonna-
DDS.
Joe, hold on for a second. I'm just gonna jump off and get onto in my car at this point. So
Good luck, Peter.
thank you. Bye.
Say hi to Kate Snow.
This is Tracy Walker again. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks so much. Joe Carvalho, DDS. So the DDS Engagement Committee met earlier this month. We began we're starting to kind of get our feet underneath us. We put together a communications tracking tool with the aim of using the way that the DDS website and the ARPA initiative page on the website breaks down our basically 6 main DDS related ARPA initiatives. So we basically built a tracking sheet around those 6 DDS initiatives with the hope of understanding as updates come out that we know what to communicate to whom and when. For example, if direct support staff, perhaps we will utilize read-in signs so that we ensure that they've received important updates that pertain to them. For a large portion of our staff, we'll be communicating via email, and at the very least on a quarterly basis. That said, we've put together this tracker and primarily reviewed that at our most recent meeting to kind of, again, try to get our feet underneath us. So I think we'll begin working on that tracker and populating it with our next update, beginning at our next meeting, which is next Tuesday. I believe that's the 7th, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, rather brief, but that is the update from the DDS Engagement Committee. Thank you.
This is Tracy Walker again. Thanks, Joe. Greg, the individual and family engagement.
Yes, hi everyone. We met about a week ago and we reviewed where the committee had the opportunity to meet representatives of the McDowell group. And as part of our process, we are looking to get a simplified or more easily understood messaging about what ARPA is and kind of an introduction to what it involves for individuals and families. To that end, we took some of the work and all the descriptions that you've all seen and tried to take some of the more salient points. Families don't necessarily care how much an incentive a provider is going to get. They more or less care about how the ARPA initiative is going to impact their loved ones. So we were trying to focus on those points for families. And in an effort to try and simplify it, we did share it with McDowell, who said it's not simple enough because we at DDS can't see beyond our complications. So they're taking a look at it now and hope to have something for our committee to review next week when we meet again, so that we can begin to get some messaging out to families as agencies start to possibly show interest in this initial phase. We kind of feel we need to let families know a little bit more what's going on so they don't hear about it through other means. So trying to get that as soon as possible. And that's pretty much where we focused our energy at our last meeting.
Okay, that was Greg McMahon that was just speaking.
Yes.
This is Tracy Walker again.
Sorry about that.
So before we move in to Betsy's update, is there any questions on any of those last 2 reports? Okay, Betsy, we're on to you.
Hello, this is Betsy Bello with Deloitte Consulting.
Oh, we're finding it difficult to hear you. This is Tracy Walker again.
Betsy Bella with Deloitte Consulting.
Yep, it's better.
I'll just lean in and yell. My preferred route. So I'm gonna share some slides. What we wanted to do today is give an update on Deloitte's approach for stakeholder input sessions. Again, just as a reminder to folks, we're supporting DDS with the moving on transformation, specifically in this phase 1 and phase 2 piece. For phase 1, as Peter noted, rolling along well, and the stakeholder input sessions are really focused on phase 2. What are these new options and what are people's reactions to them? So we're still in progress on research and identifying with DDS which pieces we want to bring forward. However, what I wanted to talk to today is around how we're going to structure the input sessions with stakeholders who we're meeting with and the general areas where we'll be asking them. And again, it's focusing on what are these options for the transformation process. So we're looking at 6 meetings with 4 different groups. I know you see 4 bullets, but that's because we're meeting with day and residential when it comes to providers and day and residential when it comes to individuals and families. So the groups are provider agencies, case managers and state staff combined into one group, individuals and families, and then meeting with individuals again in the form of the DDS self-advocates group. The reason their time is shorter is just because we're going to utilize their existing meeting rather than trying to get on people's schedule for another time. Other than the self-advocates, we are really specifically looking to engage people who are not sitting on committees like this one. So don't feel offended that you're not getting an invitation for the stakeholder input sessions. That's by design. The idea is DDS gets wonderful input from this group and others, and we really want to make sure that these input sessions bring in additional input from others. So for recruitment, we're working with some DDS partners, including the ARC of Connecticut, the Alliance, CTFSM, and then also going through regional directors, case managed supervisors to identify who are these people that aren't necessarily in the usual net who can join these sessions. We're targeting about 10 to 20 people per group. So the idea is it'll be small enough that people can really engage, and as needed, we can use breakout groups to get them to even be smaller. As you're thinking about areas for feedback, again, suggesting, potential new services, potential approaches, safeguards, and asking people, what's exciting? What are their concerns? The goal is twofold: to be able to get people's input to identify, okay, so which approaches maybe are the best to work through the process to really promote as appropriate for Connecticut, as well as identifying potential issues that we can get in front of so that they can be addressed as the rollout progresses. Similarly, related to that, right, asking people what works well for them when they are getting information about pieces like this. Current barriers to transition more generally, not just around the specific options, but when they think more generally, and we've gotten great input from groups like this on those topics previously. And then also, sometimes you get really bright ideas when you get people together in a room. So asking folks based on what they've heard, if they have additional ideas they want to raise to the group. Okay. Any questions there before I go further? Okay. There'll be other opportunities too.
This is Tracy Walker again. Michael has his hand up, Betsy.
Oh, great.
Yes, this is Michael Beloff, parent. Just one thing, for the organizations of the ARC and the Connecticut Family Support Network for individuals and families, they have less of a reach in some areas of the state, specifically Southwest Connecticut. So it's important as we're looking for geographic diversity for families and individuals who are participating to make sure that we're reaching all the different areas of the state.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Thank you, Michael. yes, having regional representation is really important to us. So I'm glad that you raised that. Do you have recommendations on organizations in those areas that might have better reach?
I think that there's a handful of agencies in that area. That's Ableist, STAR, the Kennedy Center, Old Kennedy Collective, and Ability Beyond, as well as a few others. Reaching out to those directly to get connected to families may be helpful.
Thank you so much. Just taking notes. This is Betsy Bella with Deloitte. So then as we go in further, the logistics. Won't spend too much time here, but just letting you know that these are going to be virtual sessions taking place in Zoom. Potential participants are receiving outreach emails. We do know, unfortunately, that email does limit some of our reach. However, since the sessions are taking place virtually and just given our timeframes, this is the approach that we've opted for. And it'll include the registration. We will be monitoring registration. As Michael noted, the importance of regional representation. And so monitoring registration to look to see if we're getting an appropriate blend and reaching back out through outreach as necessary. Also, for example, when we look at the provider organizations, do we have a mix of small, medium, and large? Right? We don't want the sessions to be just dominated by one group, since these efforts will impact all of them. There'll be slides and other materials. We're going to share materials out with groups ahead of time. We know that when you have this background information, if you haven't had a chance to think about it a little bit, it can be really overwhelming. And we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to hear the information, reflect on it before coming into the sessions. We'll send thank yous afterwards, of course. And then there'll be a summary of the feedback received. The feedback summary will also include information collected through a stakeholder survey that will be in addition to the input. We're meeting with McDowell this week to explore opportunities to merge our surveys, just so that people aren't being inundated by multiple things coming through. And then we are making sure that I know I'm sitting here talking really fast in front of slides that are full of words. This is not what we're going to do in the sessions, particularly sessions for individuals and families and self-advocates. We're coordinating with DDS and accessibility needs, making sure people can use verbal or chat participation options, integrating pictures for conveying information, making sure things are moving at a slower pace. Again, that idea of making sure people have time to think. There's going to be some awkward silence in these calls, and that's okay. It's important to allow people the time to reflect and think and make sure they feel comfortable responding. We've got options where people can turn on closed captioning, and then just keeping things at a simple, appropriate level as much as possible.
This is Tracy Walker again. Kevin, you have a question?
Yeah, Kevin Bronson, DDS. I was just curious on how many of these sessions are going to be either bilingual or specifically in Spanish. And sorry if you said this earlier, I was in 2 different meetings, so.
Thanks, Kevin. Betsy Bella, Deloitte. At this time, just within our scope, we're currently planning for sessions in English. However, this is something that we could potentially explore with DDS. Because, right, you are missing an important group if everything's just in English.
And Kevin Bronson, DDS, will you still be receiving information, even though the sessions won't be in English, will you still be receiving information in other languages?
Betsy Bella,
Feedback?
Deloitte. I'll have to take that back to the team. That's a great idea.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
This is Peter Mason. I know that, as we are talking about the surveys to go out and to work with McDowell, we also had talked about those surveys being in the language of the individuals, so that would be able to alleviate some of that.
Betsy Bella, Deloitte. So we've got another slide for the other groups, but starting as always with individuals and families and DDL self-advocates, the people impacted the most by the change. So these are examples of, you'll see some of the topics are similar across, and that's intentional. Just given the amount of time we'll have, we can't ask everybody everything. And so looking to provide a split across to get targeted feedback, tailored feedback. What the questions are framed as and how they look will be different for each group, given that each piece is different. And so really checking in with folks on what do they see as the impacts of transitions? Are there particular things they want to raise on how to ensure that person-centered plans, that the transition plans from the providers are really meeting the desires, preferences, and needs of the people served? What factors they think are most important, what concerns they have, and then how will this also impact family caregivers as well as the individuals receiving services? And then on the other folks for providers and case managers, where do they think DDS can provide additional support? We're not talking about financial support here, but where are some other ways that they can help make these transitions more seamless, more feasible? Depending on which transformational options are being considered, if they do require new payment methodologies and additional financial incentives, we would bring those to the provider groups. We know that workforce retention is a major concern as we consider, anything in this space, really. So having that as part of the conversation, identifying where they might need changes to infrastructure, and then this turning the new approaches into standard approaches. This is really this idea of how can DDS partner with providers so that this isn't a one and done transition approach, right? How do we make sure that this is really looking at ways to transform how they provide services, at least in some of their arenas, to really create more options for people long-term.
This is Tracy Walker again. It looks like Kevin has another question or comment.
Yeah, Kevin Bronson, DDS. Actually, can you go back a slide, please? Because my question was on the previous slide. So in this, I'm assuming you separate these as two different feedback groups. And my question is I'm assuming the assumption is that the self-advocates as a group are not partaking in any of these transformation initiatives, right? Based off of the questions you're asking.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. So the reason that since there's so much overlap in who these groups are, it's not assuming that they're not participating. It's rather making sure that we saw an opportunity to ask different sets of questions of each group to make sure that we were asking people who receive services the full range of questions. So each individual who comes to a group won't answer the full range of questions, but will be able to ask this range of questions of individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Kevin Bronson, DDS. I just want to make sure we're not excluding a group of people, right? Because they are self-advocates, but they are also, and I know that we have a self-advocate or there might be one on this, so I don't want to speak up for them, but I just want to, it's the same idea of a staff member also being a parent or that sort of thing. So, a lot of us have different roles and wear different hats. So I just want to make sure that we're not excluding one or the other. So just, maybe the move is to, explain to the self-advocates that, there are going to be different questions in this group, and maybe you should encourage them to attend both feedback sessions, because if they want if they have input personally, right? Because it seems like you're not looking for their personal input in the self-advocate. It's more of their another type of role. So I'm just assuming that that's where you're going with this, but I could be wrong.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. I think we can also have an opportunity to That's such an important part. I'm really glad you raised it. And I think there's an opportunity to reshuffle some of these bullets. So we are asking those personal questions. Maybe not all of the personal questions, but making sure we are hitting on some of those personal questions with the self-advocates group, as well as with the individuals and families group.
Thank you.
And also that idea of, explaining to them, because I don't want anyone to leave that session thinking, well, why didn't they ask this? Really important there.
Yeah, and Kevin Bronson again, it goes back to this slide too, right? Like I said, someone can be a case manager and a family member too. So, it's not one or the other, it's one and.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. I think there's also a really great, that's going to be really important as we think about survey design. Making sure that people have the opportunity to respond to multiple sets of questions, right? Because you don't want to make people pick one hat. And understanding if somebody does wear multiple hats certainly does influence the answers you get. Thank you. Any other questions from the group around these tailored feedback pieces?
This is Tracy Walker again, Wynn.
Yeah, I'm looking at the paper that was distributed prior to the meeting. These sessions are going to all be in person or Zoom sessions? Both or just Zoom?
Betsy Bella Deloitte, they'll be just Zoom.
I'm sorry, I should identify myself as well. Just Zoom, okay. And they'll all be recorded, and then will the ARC Connecticut example be the one recording, or will you be doing the recording, Deloitte?
Betsy Bella Deloitte. So we are potentially going to record the sessions. However, the recordings will not be made available. We think that that's important in a stakeholder session so that people feel comfortable sharing freely and openly, knowing that what they're sharing is private within the group.
So Wynn Everts again, yes, I agree with that. Okay, thank you.
Tracy Walker again, Kevin.
This is Peter Mason. And we also talked about DDS not being present at these sessions so that people can feel freely to talk and stuff as well.
Okay, this is Tracy Walker again, Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin Bronson, DDS. Is there a reason why you chose not to do in person? And the reason why I ask is because a lot of the feedback that I received is that specifically for individuals and families is that people have a hard time interacting with Zoom or some other electronic platform. So again, we're technically leaving out a subset of people that we may or may not want to get feedback from. So I just didn't know if we had any ideas of maybe having some of these in person, specifically for individuals and families, or at least to think about the individual and family one as an in-person one.
Betsy Bella Deloitte, thank you for that feedback. We'll take it back and consider it.
Kevin Bronson again. So, and just, never mind. Never mind.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Kevin, I think you've got my email. So if you have additional thoughts, please do send them our way. And then also, of course, we're still here on this call. So really happy to hear whatever thoughts you have and to consider them as we move forward with these. Because as you can see on the schedule, we're identifying some early sessions to get moving. I will flag though that these dates have not yet been, they will be soon, but have not quite yet been publicized. And so if it makes more sense, like for example, if one of the individuals and family sessions moves to in person, likely move it to January. But that would still leave us plenty of time targeting towards the end of January for the feedback to be included. The other idea here is that we are starting with individuals and families. You know, if we're hearing really consistent feedback from them on, we're just not interested in this approach or that approach, we're going to update what we're sharing as we get into the later sessions. And then we have the nice bookend, of course, of more folks who receive services, DDS self-advocates, as we get into January to make sure that we're still continuing, if we have made adjustments, to get that important feedback. So that's the logic behind why this is laid out how it is. I'll pause there.
Kevin Bronson, DDS. So I'm just, my concern is that, you're going to listen to feedback, right? So you're only going to hear information from people that actually showed up via an electronic means, right? So we're not getting any feedback from people who may not be able to access Zoom, maybe be able to get on a computer and read a document, but not maybe be able to access Zoom. And also, just on an aside, we can have a conversation, because I think some of these, just generally speaking, some of these dates I don't think are going to end up working out, because we have previously scheduled session stuff set up for DDS things, and I just don't want. I know that DDS is not going to be involved in these meetings, but I want to make sure that we're not competing for the same group of people on the same day.
Thank you. That's Betsy Bella Deloitte. I'm glad you flagged that. Let's make sure that we coordinate on, I'll send you an email about which dates we have issues with, and we can coordinate.
This is Tracy Walker. Adriana shared in the chat, will in-person limit families by location and access to getting to the location meeting, was a question that she posed.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Yes, that's also an excellent point. It starts to become, if we are doing in-person, making sure to do in-person in multiple arenas and spots, which, adds additional complications. Doesn't make it impossible, but it's certainly an excellent thing to keep in mind.
This is Tracy Walker again. Does that bring you to the conclusion of what you had to present, Betsy?
Betsy Bella Deloitte, it does. Welcome any additional feedback. This has been really excellent food for thought. And any other questions or concerns would be great to hear.
This is Peter Mason. Betsy, could you just give like a high level view of the states that you've been looking at and where that is at this point?
Absolutely. So the states that we've reviewed are Arkansas, Delaware, Pennsylvania. I think I'd have them really quick. Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Missouri. And there's probably somebody who's like, Maine, of course, Maine. See, I keep forgetting Maine because there have been slower to respond to our emails. So we've conducted initial desk review to identify where our states and also understanding their system as a whole, because it's important that, for example, there's some neat things that Arkansas is doing that are really connected to their managed care. So that's not going to be appropriate for within Connecticut. But that doesn't mean there aren't lessons learned within their systems. We've heard some, Pennsylvania has some interesting pieces, actually very closely aligned to what Connecticut's attempting to do here on the residential side. It's newer though. That's the thing, is when you're pushing at the front of the pack, everybody else is either behind you or coming right alongside. But we are developing the report. We have most of the desk research in. There were just a couple of interviews where it was harder to find people around the holidays that we're getting in now. The intent is to share this report with the group once it's been finalized. So you'll all have a chance to take a look through it. It will include the recommendations that will then be funneled into these stakeholder input sessions to get that input. So, I'll pause there. I see there's a couple of questions.
So this is Tracy Walker again. When?
Actually, I think Michael's in line before me.
Tracy Walker again. Go ahead, Michael.
Michael Beloff, parent. Betsy, I was just wondering why those particular states were chosen, because Arkansas, especially Arkansas, Missouri, and Maine, as low Medicaid funding states, those are states where there are wait lists for day services, which we don't have here in Connecticut, and they don't feel like they're similar in terms of how our services are delivered in terms of the populations and the commitment of the states to funding those services. And they're also not as progressive generally as Connecticut has tended to be.
So the reason that these were identified as, I know they do seem like an odd group. And part of that is we were specifically identifying states with transformation, right? How do you bring providers on board? How do you communicate to people who receive services and stakeholders? And sometimes to get to that question of how are we making big change, you have to go to the states that do have waitlists because they need to make big change. And so, for example, in Missouri, they do have promising employment efforts underway, and that was one of the reasons that we specifically identified them, is that across the 5 states, be able to find highlights and interesting ideas across day and residential, knowing that there's not one state who has all the solutions and all the answers. Does that help?
Michael Bella, parent, I appreciate that these are states that are transforming their services, and certainly for part of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of how do we move people from one type of service to another. I just have my doubts as to whether the services they're providing are the ones that we want to transform into, as opposed to models like New York and Massachusetts, which have robust different service models already and have been doing it for many years and may provide guidance into the type of services we want to provide, because transformation is 2 parts. It, yes, is the movement from one service model to another, but to me, the bigger part of it is what are we transforming the services into? And then we can figure out how to get there.
Betsy Bella, Deloitte, thank you for that. Yes, we did in the initial review and scan look at certainly New York and also Massachusetts, and opted in coordination with EDS to focus instead on these states. It doesn't mean that we are totally ignoring those other service provisions and options. But we were really seeking in this scan to look into what are the pieces that are lesser known. And so that's why the review and reporting has focused where it has. And it does include, of course, what are those new options? What are those different approaches for the end and not just the transformation?
Okay, this is Tracy Walker again. Wynn followed by Barry, please.
Hi, Wynn Everts, the ARC of Connecticut, and a parent. So I may not have heard properly when you were explaining the 5 states, but how many of the 5 states practice managed care versus our methodology in Connecticut?
This is Betsy Bella and Deloitte. Arkansas is definitely a managed long-term services and support state. And then there are some that are only fee for service. And then I think some that are a blend. We were focusing in our review on waiver services, since this, without excluding it to waiver services. And so they are all states that are operating 1915C waivers, much like in Connecticut. And in that sense would be appropriate comparisons.
Wynn Everts, the ARC of Connecticut, and a parent. So these were the states that were chosen because they had the clearest alignment with what's trying to be described as transformation here in Connecticut. Is that a better way of paraphrasing it? In other words, they're not based on payment models so much as it is on residential and employment transformation.
Betsy Bella Deloitte, it's a blend, right? And so, I think in one of these sessions early on, we had a conversation around how it was going to be how there's not another Connecticut out there, right? There's not a Connecticut that's out there and just doing it better. And so making sure that by looking across the states, we really have a mix where some are very similar in size. Some have really interesting residential pieces. Some have incredible employment efforts and outcomes, and making sure that when you look across the 5, it creates kind of a picture that helps as much as possible to dot on all of those pieces.
Thank you for that.
Okay, this is Tracy Walker again. Barry?
So Barry Simon O'Kill. So as you were doing this analysis, and certainly I can speak to knowing a little bit about Arkansas, and as you said, I can understand the logic in that. They started out with a goal of, we are going to reduce the wait list. We are going to transform the system. They worked in collaboration with providers and parents and the state the state agency to be tackling this in a way that it was all about how do we reduce the wait list and provide more services to more people. And so from that standpoint, if that's kind of the philosophy that you're trying to absorb, that would be wonderful. If, I could say from that standpoint. And then from the way that you're approaching this, I don't know, I know I've said this a couple of times, if you have done any kind of actuarial analysis to know how many people are we trying to deal with that are either one, on the wait list coming into the system, and how many people are projected to be leaving the system, in order to know how we're trying to manage towards how are we providing more services, more service options to more people. And then using all of these kind of best practices that you're referencing, that there's these states with this good service, those states with those good service, and how do we incorporate all of that into the system that we want to design in order to give the people the right options at the right time, and give people I'm going to say that, the parents of the world, the opportunity to believe that no matter what their child needs, there's going to be service options for them. And just because they're trying a new service doesn't mean they're losing an old service, kind of thing. And that to me is how we need to be messaging this. And what you're doing in your analysis, I hope, is gathering all of this information to kind of put these pieces together and to create the picture from the puzzle.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Thank you, Barry. Yes, no, we have the list of outcomes that are desired that this group and some of the other groups the committees help to pull together, right? And one of those, it's not about everybody moves into one of these alternative services, right? It's expanding the range of options. And what we're seeing in the other states, right, that is what the case has been. There isn't anyone who's trying to close every community living arrangement, for example. I know that kind of comes up periodically as the example here. That's not what we're trying to do, despite some rumors. And so then also to your question on actuarial analysis on sort of the flow and necessity of number of people in the system. And we have had some conversations with DDS around this. It is not a step that people have flagged as part of their own planning and their transformation in other states. It's not that particular specific analysis is not currently part of our plans for this. We have, however, been looking at the payment rates and methodologies in other states related, especially around these kinds of services.
And I guess I know, again, specifically in Arkansas and I think Missouri, the legislature added significant dollars to the system it wasn't a zero-sum game process. And in our case, you know, the legislature has added money for wages, lifting the floor from a pitifully low floor, but it's still been a zero-sum game because there has not been, you know, dollars added to the system for A&G. And, you know, the last time we saw any kind of, you know, rate increases on A&G, the iPhone hadn't even been invented. And we're still operating on gas that was $1.67 a gallon. So, you know, the legislature needs to add money into the system, not just for wages and benefits, if they want to create and or use other resources to broaden the spectrum of service, you know, options.
Well, and I think this is Peter Mason. First off, there's a number of states out there, and we had to limit our review. We couldn't just do every state would be here forever. And Connecticut is, from what I understand, the only state that doesn't do direct billing at this point. And so we're unique in that aspect. And we have rates, but they're still not consistent across the board. Even that last legislation, as you know, Barry, has really tipped the scales even more out of whack. And so we're going to look at all these states, and even if we had the best example of it, to move to that where we are is not going to happen overnight. And because trying to balance those rates, unless we move everybody up to the top rate, which I don't see the state doing this, is going to be a challenge. So what we've done is we've looked at the different states with the different initiatives they're doing, and we chose the ones that we thought had promise for us to be able to learn from and to be able to move forward. I do want to say, what we're hearing back from Deloitte is that Connecticut is by no means behind the 8 ball in this. In a lot of ways, we're ahead of a lot of states, and probably most states. So trying to find somebody who's ahead of us is not an easy piece out there, because we're moving in a direction that is in a lot of ways further ahead than most other states. So that's why we're trying to see these different initiatives to see how that will help us move even further where we want to go. And I know rates are important and I know all that stuff, but I'm going to say it again. We're here for the transformation part, and I know a rates part of it, and I know that you guys have been working with the commissioner on that piece of it. This piece here is to move forward with the transformation part of it. I do also want to say that there is a DSS rate study that's coming down the pike. They're still in negotiations as to what that looks like. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of tied some of our hands with Deloitte in terms of what they can do in terms of methodologies. So we're waiting for the scope to be finalized so that there can be a conversation between Deloitte and their contractor as to how Deloitte can assist or provide additional information to them as we move forward. So those are the couple things.
So Peter, I appreciate that, and I agree with most of what you're saying. I don't want
Really?
my
Oh, good.
my
Thanks.
comments, to be construed as that. But like I said, knowing that the rate component is a DSS issue and is a legislative advocacy issue, we can approach this where we want to design the best system, setting the standard with a continuum of care options that are, above and beyond what most other states are offering. And if you listen to the politicians, they will tell you that they believe in the, in the virtues of adequate pay and all those kinds of things, and they'll point the fingers at others gladly. And as I always say, please, hold up a mirror and look at yourselves. But if we're designing the system, then we should be focused on designing the system that we want with the service options that we want. And, as I always say, if you want to look at rates, then all you need to do is look at how I'm regulated. And if you add up what your regulations call for, the amount of doc time, nurse time, all those things, then just put the price tag on it, and then you could see what my rate should be. But they don't want to do that. They want to, but that's, to me, either we separate the process and design the system we want, or we are willing to talk about, the chicken and egg that rates and services play off of each other. But it's hard to just kind of live in limbo land without acknowledging either.
All I can say is that, I know the commissioner's heard, that's why he sat down with the Alliance in terms of this, but in terms of this group here, we are looking at the transformation piece of it. So, and, we just need to start moving forward.
Hey, this is Tracy Walker again. Wynn, did you have something additional?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just going to, whenever it's the ARPA Connecticut and a parent, I just wanted to go back into the stakeholder survey piece for a second. I think, I guess I'm asking you a question in a slightly different way than that's already been asked. But when are we going to identify the alternatives? In other words, if we're going to ask people for what their choices would be for new things, when are we going to tell them what those choices might be? Because the majority of people live in what we're talking about as congregate settings. And so what do those new things look like, and how do you suggest they get described in an informational meeting?
This is flexible. Peter, did you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll just jump. I think this first piece that they're looking for is information as to what people are looking for. I don't think it's not the information as to here's what all the different things are. I think, we need to figure out how to do what you just said in terms of asking, these are all the different alternatives. This is what we're doing. But right now we're trying to get input from everybody as to what they're looking for. I mean, I think it's, it's a different. I understand where you're coming from. And just there's too little time to do everything. So we're trying to figure out how to get this in a way that's the most constructive.
So I think that that's going to be a very hard thing for people to engage with. And so I'm suggesting that we possibly take a plain vanilla, maybe vanilla with chocolate chips in it approach, and describe what happens in other states that are large things. We've coined the phrase supported living for just the IDASH programs in the state. We should also probably include what Connecticut calls shared living and other people call supported living in other states, which is, a non-provider controlled home and stuff like that. I'm concerned that you're not going to really get people choosing things, and instead the choices that they may make are based on the size of the budgets associated with them, which is probably not the data that you want to see come back from this.
Gotcha. Okay. We can take it back. We can take back and talk about that.
This is Tracy Walker again. Barry?
So Barry Simon O'Kill. Yeah, so going along what Wynn had said, and I think Michael had also mentioned, that if we are able to, whether you as, DDS proper as the, managing entity says, here are the continuum of care options without names on it that we want to create, then it gives, the appearance of a continuum of care. So whether, even if you call it, service X, service Y, service Z, I don't think it's going to matter as long as you're able to define why this level of care is different than another level. And then you're giving people kind of that sense of options to choose from. But if you're just, going out and saying, all right, tell us what you want, I don't know that you're going to, get any kind of clarity. And New York, Massachusetts, us, and other departments, I mean, there's a lot of different options to choose from that you could put together. All right, here are the 5 different levels of residential care. Then you get into independent living, and you can pick a couple of different options there. So and then you put all that together and you've got your continuum.
Tracy Walker again, Kevin, and then Kathleen.
Sure, Kevin Bronson, DDS. I guess kind of going maybe not directly off of what Wynn and Barry were saying, but slightly, is that, when we are looking at comparing with other these other states, when we talk about a comparison, right, are we just looking at, we call them, let's, for lack of a better term, like a group home, right? And when are we making these comparison, a group home in Connecticut to a group home in, let's say, another state, and that sort of stuff? And are we just looking at the name? Are we looking at the actual way that these systems are put together? Are we, because obviously, like, the example would be, we call a sandwich a grinder up here, but it's a hoagie in Philly and whatever. That's all the same, right? But I just didn't know if when we make these comparisons, the names might be different, the names might be the same, but the instances might be slightly different. And if they are, I don't know if we're making note of that. So
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Yes, we are noting what do things actually mean, how are states using them, pulling from service definitions where appropriate. It's not looking across, this is what everybody means when they say, here they say a group home, here they see a CLA. It's not that level of comparison. It's really focused on where are the pieces that it's enough of a comparison to sort of understand how are the systems similar and different, and then focused on pulling out the elements of pieces to learn from. And in that, yes, always making sure that we're being clear on what does something mean? Because yeah, somebody might say, oh no, we're moving towards shared living. And if that means something different in that state, making sure that we are clear on what it is.
Kevin Bronson, DDS, and this might be a question for Peter, but and when we talk about system, we're talking about, we're just solely specifically talking about residential transformation and day services transformation. We're not talking about DDS as the system as a whole.
Right.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Actually, we are. I'm glad you know that, because that's something I forgot to mention. We are looking at, chiefly looking at residential and day service transformations. However, we also looked at some, especially in Connecticut, sister agencies as to examples of, especially mental health, behavioral health, of where might there be lessons learned for community-based approaches that meet people where they are and include housing, both in Connecticut and in some other states. We talked with DSS about, did due diligence about checking in on money follows the person, right? All but one of the states in the group is an MFP state. That's a major transition program, not IDD specific, although included that population in many states. And so really looking across the gamut. But back to your initial question there, when we do talk about system transformation, it is a bit of a range. Sometimes it's around what were they doing for just employment supports within this waiver. And other times it is looking more holistically at the state. It just really depends on the piece.
So Kevin Bronson, DDS. So it's a system transfer. So for the lack of better terms, you're looking at just a very like the residential day system. You're not looking at anything else. Okay. And do you compare how they interact with each other? Like, I guess so some states might have, let's say, for example, like maybe a community or sheltered or congregate or sheltered work environment might be better, compared to a more community-based living environment, right? Like those are more successful than, both. I guess that, those are, if we're looking at the system, are we making comparisons from day to day, residential, and then day and res? Or how are we looking at this?
Betsy Bella Deloitte, yes. Looking at transformations of like to, obviously it's not like to like, but not apples to apples, not apples to oranges.
And Kevin Bronson again from DDS, and when you make these comparisons, I'm assuming you're making comparisons to other agencies that provide IDD services in other states, and then you said sister agencies in our own state. Are you looking at sister agencies in other states as well? Like you mentioned mental health in Connecticut, but are you looking at mental health in other states?
Betsy Bella Deloitte, specifically in Delaware, we've been trying to speak with their mental health folks. They have something called the Promise Program. So it's kind of like this cascading research, right? Our highest priority is IDD transformations that include an endpoint that is the same kind of endpoint where Connecticut's trying to get to. IDD transformations and sister agency IDD transformations that are still reaching for a high level, but maybe something Connecticut's more familiar with. Sister agencies reaching for that high point, right? And then I think we keep using this word comparison. There are some comparisons in the report. We were looking for states, but the chief purpose isn't kind of like a map of comparing each state system. It is really looking at looking for evidence-based practices, looking for lessons learned in order to identify pieces that can be taken to these stakeholder input sessions and included in the design of the transformational model that DDS wants to partner with providers to move forward through this transformation process.
Kevin Bronson, I promise this is my last question. Are we looking also at, because I'll leave it open to others, are we also looking at, when we look at these other states, right, and I won't use the word comparison, but when we look at the other states, are we taking a look at, wait list sizes, wait lists for different stuff, obviously, a look at what their workforce looks like and that sort of stuff. Just because we can look at the numbers, right, that the government puts out, but there's reality somewhere else, right? So
Betsy Bella Deloitte, I'm glad you added that piece at the end because that's what we were finding, right? We were pulling those numbers, we were looking at them, and then you would find two totally different numbers for the same state. And so in our initial scan that we were working with our DDS contacts on which states are we can pursue, those were absolutely part of it. A lot of those numbers we've removed from the final report that's moving forward, just because where those numbers become most useful is looking across. And if you're pulling from different data sources, it's not a useful exercise for the comparison. We can consider moving that back in if that would be useful. Now, in terms of wait lists, those are flagged in the narrative and are included in the pieces because obviously that's an important part.
And this is all publicly available data, right? You're not directly reaching out to these IDD states and asking for the data, that you're just pulling it from their websites.
Betsy Bella Deloitte, in terms of the data Yes, that was publicly available. We are conducting interviews around the transformation pieces, the real meat of the report, the elements that are most driving to our next stage. There we are pulling from not publicly available information as well.
Thank you.
Tracy Walker again, Kathleen?
Thank you. You know, in a prior life, I would always caution my teams, you know, when I was working in for-profit, that the best way to serve a customer is to anticipate what a customer needs before they realize it. You know, if you look at the iPhone, for example, you know, I'm sure some data went into that, but it was really a creative and ingenious journey into the future use of the phone. And when we started our volunteer corps here at the ARC, nobody signed up for it. And I always use this as an illustration of the poverty of expectation that afflicts the IDD services field. Nobody, it turned out, knew what volunteering was. If you want to talk about a poverty of expectation, imagine having a life as a person with IDD where you've never encountered volunteerism until you're, you know, 30 years old. And so as we're looking at what the future for people looks like, I think we want to be really mindful that the real life-changing, pioneering milestones of our lives are not necessarily data-driven. And so I have some concern. I think it's really good that we're looking at what other states are doing. I think we have to do that. But I think we also need to allow for some room for people to dream. And I know that that's not always what government does best. But I would really like to see people's dreams coming true. And for that to happen, they have to know what a dream looks like.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Thank you, Kathleen. Beautifully said. And
But
heard.
this is Tracy Walker again. Before we go to Barry, I just want to make sure that Adriana's question in the chat gets addressed. Is the goal of feedback from families to get out of the box ideas and creative ideas that could possibly change how current services are being used? Also, are we looking at educating families on the current options and how they have progressed from when they looked at them in the past? And when I say services, I mean funding.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. So the chief inputs are going to be, here's, it kind of ties right, actually really nicely into what Kathleen was just saying, right? People might not know what a dream looks like. And so starting by sharing, here's some of the things that are happening in other states, based on what's happening in other states, here's some things we think could happen in Connecticut. How do you feel about these items? Now, having heard about these, are there other thoughts that you have? And so starting from this concrete space and leaving room for that out of the box. We do certainly want to have room for, you never know what might be that next, to borrow Kathleen's example, that next iPhone. And so if there is a bright idea in the room, if there's something that is feasible, makes sense, aligns to the goals and visions, we are open to hearing it and seeing how it could fit into the transformation model. And then I think educating families on the current options and how they have progressed from what they looked at them in the past. Thank you. I think that might be a really helpful way to frame some of these sessions so that it makes sense for folks. Because I think we, in this HCBS transformation world, you do often get caught up in, we're always thinking towards the future. But understanding that foundation of where we started can be really helpful, right? That idea of, you know, there are still people where it is appropriate and where they're receiving their services in ICF. But there was a movement to where now people receive their services in the community. And now we're talking about what does that next step look like? So thank you for that. I think that that could be a helpful way for things to work.
Tracy Walker, Barry?
Yes, so Barry Simon O'Kill. So, you know, again, I go back to our overarching goal is that we want to transform this system to set the standard for the country on, what are the service options that are available and how do we operate. And so from that standpoint, I like the fact that we're out, we're gathering, data points, but, borrowing best practice or promising practice from other areas is often the key to transformation. It is very rare that somebody just invents something out of thin air. And so to that end, I think there's a lot of information that could be gathered for us to be creating service model or the continuum of care options or whatever you want to call DDS services. And that's what we're transforming. That, I hope that's what we're transforming to is, the service models of the future. And how we do that and how you're asking people and what you're trying to gather to give them, that message and that idea to be telling us, I think is a good process, but it's got to be this mix of, helping people to, as, Kathleen said, know what they're dreaming about or even know what are the possibilities, because it's very rare that they're just gonna, dream on their own.
Betsy Bella, yes, thank you for that. That's the intent. That's the plan. I also see a comment from Kevin in the chat to make sure that the planned forums are not just about the numbers. I just want to be really clear. The forums are going to be very little about numbers. They're really going to be about this transformational process, about especially the forums with individuals and families, around what does the service look like? What does it mean for the person who's living that life? And only with the, only, it's not about here are all the numbers crunched. The number crunching will happen after the stakeholder input sessions with our actuarial team.
This is Tracy Walker. There's another comment from Adriana too. Person-centered planning and life course helps with dreaming as well, thinking about services based on the whole person and living a good life.
Betsy Bella Deloitte. Yes, we're very familiar with charting the life.
5 minutes. This is Tracy Walker again. We have 5 minutes left. So I don't know if there are one more comment or question. Peter, this is Tracy again. Peter, were you able to cover everything you wanted to cover earlier?
Yes, I think the only thing was about the transition outcomes and so what I'll do is I'll send that out to everybody. And then they can provide comments back to us. How's that sound?
Oh, this is Tracy Walker again. Yep, sounds like a plan. Anything else for the good of the order before we adjourn? Barry, is your hand left up from before?
Yes, it was.
Win.
I'm sorry, whenever it's our Connecticut and parent, when do you want these notifications to go out? Did you say that the dates are not quite set in stone yet? And how will we be notified that you want us to send it out?
Betsy Bella Deloitte. I thought the dates were until Kevin raised that there were some potential conflicts. So I am gonna coordinate with Kevin and then back with Peter and team to make sure we can't get those sent. So we've drafted outreach to the ARC as well as language that you can use or adapt to send out further. And we would really love to get it out sooner rather than later, just so people have time to think for it, plan for it, get it on their schedules. Especially, when you're interrupting someone's routine, you want to have them plenty of time to make sure they can adjust. And so as needed, we can shift things a little bit, but you'll be hearing about it certainly this week.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, this is Tracy Walker. Anything else before we adjourn? All right, our next meeting is December 13th. So we will see everyone then.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.